A fortune teller once warned that Natalie Wood would die from drowning, and the prophecy haunted her from childhood until the night it came true. But when investigators pulled her body from the Pacific at dawn, everyone asks the same question. Why would a woman terrified of water take a dinghy alone at midnight? Her husband says she slipped while securing the boat, but the captain had a different story. Her husband says he called for help immediately he found out she was missing, but Coast Guard logs show he waited over 90 minutes. Her husband says there was no fight between them that night, but witnesses on nearby boats heard screaming followed by silence. And when detectives finally reopen the case and re-observe images of her bruised body, they say she looks like a victim of assault. Robert Wagner knows what happened to his wife, but he's chosen silence over truth, and that silence might be the loudest confession of all. This is the sad story of Hollywood's most loved actress, Natalie Wood. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco, California, to Russian immigrant parents who barely spoke English. Her father, Nicholas, worked as a day laborer and carpenter, building sets for Hollywood productions when the work came through. Her mother, Maria Gurdin, had once dreamed of becoming an actress herself, but marriage and motherhood had stolen that dream away. So she did what countless stage mothers before her had done. She decided her daughter would live the life she never got to have. Maria was obsessed, driven by a prophecy that would haunt both their lives. A fortune teller in Los Angeles had looked at baby Natalia and made a chilling prediction. This child would grow up to become famous, known around the world, but she would die young in dark water. Most mothers would have dismissed such a prediction as carnival nonsense, but Maria believed every word, and instead of protecting her daughter from water, she used the fear as motivation. If Natalia was destined for fame, Maria would make sure she got there before the water could take her. RKO executives, David Lewis and William Goetz, decided to change her last name to Wood, believing it would resonate better with English-speaking audiences and also serve as a nod of respect to filmmaker Sam Wood. Her first feature film was called Happy Land, shot in 1943 in Santa Rosa, California, where the family had moved to escape the poverty of San Francisco. Maria pushed her way onto that set with the determination of a woman possessed, and she got what she wanted. A small role for her daughter that would open doors to bigger opportunities. Hollywood noticed the dark-haired little girl with the expressive eyes, and within 3 years, Natalie Wood was cast in a film that would make her a household name. Miracle on 34th Street hit theaters in 1947, and 8-year-old Natalie stole every scene she appeared in as Susan Walker, the little girl who didn't believe in Santa Claus. America fell in love with her instantly, but behind the scenes, Maria's controlling grip was tightening like a noose around her daughter's childhood. Natalie wasn't allowed to play with other children unless it benefited her career. Couldn't go to regular school because tutors on set were more convenient, and spent every waking moment being groomed for stardom. Maria even accompanied her to the bathroom on set, never letting the child out of her sight for fear someone might steal her precious investment. But the most damaging thing Maria did was pass on the prophecy about dark water, telling Natalie over and over that she would die by drowning, planting seeds of terror that would grow into a lifelong phobia. When Natalie was 10 years old, that fear became horrifyingly real during the filming of The Green Promise in 1949. The script called for a bridge to collapse during a storm scene, sending actors tumbling into the water below. Maria assured Natalie the stunt was completely safe, that professional coordinators had planned everything down to the last detail. But something went catastrophically wrong. The bridge collapsed too early, before safety divers were in position, and Natalie plunged into the raging water unprepared and terrified. She broke her wrist in the fall, nearly drowned before crew members could pull her out, and left the water traumatized in ways that would never fully heal. From that moment forward, Natalie's fear of water intensified into full-blown phobia. She couldn't wash her own hair without someone holding her, refused to take baths alone, and had recurring nightmares of being pulled under by invisible hands. Swimming lessons were out of the question. Natalie would never learn how to swim, would never overcome the terror that gripped her every time she saw deep water. But Hollywood didn't care about her childhood trauma or irrational fears, because Natalie Wood was making money, lots of it, and the studios kept casting her in bigger roles. She worked constantly through her teenage years, transitioning from child star to ingenue with remarkable ease. In 1955, at just 16 years old, Natalie landed the role that would prove she was more than a cute kid who could cry on command. Rebel Without a Cause paired her with James Dean and Sal Mineo, two troubled young actors who understood the darkness brewing beneath Hollywood's glossy surface. Dean would die in a car crash just before the film's release. Mineo would be murdered years later, and Natalie would drown in circumstances that still raise questions, 4 decades later. But in 1955, they were just 3 talented kids trying to survive an industry that chewed people up and spit them out, without mercy. Natalie's performance earned her an Academy Award nomination at 17, cementing her status as a serious actress who could handle complex emotional material. That same year, Natalie started dating Robert Wagner, a 26-year-old actor who'd been working in Hollywood since 1950. RJ, as everyone called him, came from a wealthy family and carried himself with the effortless charm of someone who'd never struggled for anything. He was handsome in that classic 1950s way, square jaw, perfect hair, dazzling smile, and he knew exactly how to make a young woman feel like the center of his universe. They went on their first date on Natalie's 18th birthday in July 1956, and RJ swept her off her feet with romantic gestures that seemed straight out of a movie script. He was attentive, protective, and mature in ways the boys her age weren't, probably because he was nearly a decade older and had learned how to play the Hollywood game. Natalie fell hard and fast, seeing in RJ the stability and love she'd never gotten from her controlling mother. They married in December 1957 in a lavish ceremony that made headlines across the country. Natalie was 19, RJ was 27, and the press dubbed them Hollywood's golden couple, perfect and untouchable. Magazine covers featured them posing in their home, smiling at premieres, living the dream that millions of fans wished they could have. But behind the carefully constructed facade, the marriage was already cracking under the weight of expectations neither of them could meet. RJ's career stalled, while Natalie's soared, and the professional jealousy. Like acid, she was getting offered major roles in prestige pictures, working with legendary directors, earning critical acclaim and huge paychecks. Meanwhile, RJ was stuck doing television guest spots and supporting roles in forgettable films, watching his wife become the star he'd always wanted to be. The insecurity manifested as control. He wanted to know where she was at all times, questioned her friendships with male co-stars, and made passive-aggressive comments about her success that were meant to sound like jokes, but cut deep. Natalie tried to hold the marriage together, even turning down roles to spend more time at home, but it wasn't enough. By 1961, after just 4 years of marriage, they were both miserable and unwilling to admit the fairy tale had been a lie from the start. The divorce came in 1962, shocking fans who believed in the image they'd been sold. Natalie was 23 years old. Already divorced, and about to enter the most creatively successful period of her life. She threw herself into work with renewed energy, as if proving something to everyone who thought she couldn't survive without RJ. West Side Story had already hit theaters in 1961, showcasing Natalie's ability to carry a massive musical production, even though her singing voice was dubbed. The film became one of the biggest hits of the decade, winning 10 Academy Awards and making Natalie one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood. She followed that success with Splendor in the Grass in 1961, directed by Elia Kazan and written by William Ing. Natalie played Deanie, a young woman in 1920s Kansas who suffers a mental breakdown after being denied the love she desperately needs. The role was intensely personal. Natalie channeled her own feelings of being controlled, manipulated, and denied agency over her own life. Her performance earned her a second Academy Award nomination and proved she could do raw, emotional work that went beyond the pretty innocent roles she'd been given as a teenager. During the filming of Splendor in the Grass, Natalie started dating Warren Beatty, her co-star and one of Hollywood's most notorious playboys. Beatty was ambitious, sexually magnetic, and completely wrong for her, which made him irresistible. They had a passionate, volatile relationship that mirrored the one they played on screen, intense, consuming, and ultimately destructive. Beatty wasn't interested in marriage or commitment, and Natalie realized after 2 years that she was wasting time on someone who would never give her what she wanted: a family, stability, a partner who put her first. In 1963, Natalie met British producer Richard Gregson through mutual friends in the industry. Gregson was older, sophisticated, and seemed like the mature partner she'd been searching for. They married in May 1969 after a 6-year courtship, and Natalie immediately got pregnant with their first child. Natasha Gregson was born in September 1970, giving Natalie the motherhood experience she'd craved since childhood. But the marriage to Gregson fell apart even faster than her first marriage to RJ. Reports of infidelity on Gregson's part surfaced within 2 years, and Natalie filed for divorce in 1972, devastated that she'd failed at marriage twice before turning 35. She was now a single mother with a toddler, trying to rebuild her personal life while maintaining her career, and the pressure was enormous. And then, in one of Hollywood's strangest love stories, Natalie went back to RJ. They'd stayed in touch after their divorce, running in the same social circles, and occasionally seeing each other at industry events. 10 years had passed since their marriage ended, and both claimed they'd grown up, matured, and learned from their mistakes. Friends warned Natalie against giving RJ another chance, reminding her of how jealous and controlling he'd been, but she made the decision anyway. Lana Wood, Natalie's younger sister, remembered the family dinner where Natalie announced she was remarrying RJ. The whole family was there, gathered in the living room, and Natalie stood up to make the announcement. Lana expected her to sound happy, excited, glowing with the kind of joy you'd expect from someone about to marry the love of their life. Instead, Natalie looked down at the floor and said something that made everyone in the room worried. Sometimes it's better to be with the devil you know than the devil you don't. It was such a strange, ominous thing to say about your future husband, and Lana never forgot it. The statement revealed that Natalie wasn't going back to RJ out of passionate love or belief that things would be different. She was choosing him because he was familiar, predictable, and less terrifying than starting over with someone new. She knew his flaws, understood his jealousies, and believed she could manage them better now that she was older and wiser. They remarried in July 1972, and for a while it actually seemed to work. Natalie gave birth to their daughter, Courtney, in March 1974, giving RJ the biological child he'd always wanted. Natalie also began pulling back from acting, focusing more on motherhood and letting RJ's career take center stage for the first time in their relationship. He landed the lead role in a new television series called Switch in 1975, and then in 1979, he became the star of Heart to Heart, a show about a wealthy couple who solved crimes together. Heart to Heart made RJ a television superstar, finally giving him the fame and recognition he'd always craved. For the first time in their relationship, RJ was the bigger star, and Natalie seemed content to let him have the spotlight. She did some television work, a few film roles here and there, but nothing that would overshadow her husband's newfound success. Friends say the power shift seemed to ease some of RJ's insecurity, but the jealousy never fully went away. It just went dormant, waiting for the right trigger to bring it roaring back. That trigger came in 1981, when Natalie accepted a starring role in Brainstorm, a science fiction thriller about scientists who invent a device that can record and play back human experiences. Her co-star was Christopher Walken, a 37-year-old actor who'd just won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in The Deer Hunter. Walken was talented, intense, and had a peculiar charisma that made him fascinating to watch on screen and off. Natalie and Walken had chemistry, the kind that directors love and husbands hate. They spent long hours on set together, got along effortlessly, and seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. Rumors started circulating around the Brainstorm set that their connection might be more than professional, and those rumors eventually reached RJ's ears. He didn't confront Natalie directly. Instead, he showed up unannounced at the filming location, watching from the sidelines like a jealous boyfriend, making his presence known without saying a word. The crew noticed the tension immediately, but Natalie and Walken continued working as if nothing was wrong. By November, Brainstorm was on a filming break for the Thanksgiving holiday, and RJ suggested they take the yacht out to Catalina Island for the weekend. It would be a chance to relax, reconnect, and spend some quality time together away from the pressures of Hollywood. Then RJ made a decision that would change everything. He invited Christopher Walken to join them. Some people thought it was a power move, RJ's way of asserting dominance by bringing the perceived threat into his own territory. Others thought he was testing Natalie, watching how she interacted with Walken in front of him. And a few people close to the couple thought RJ was just being self-destructive, creating a situation that was bound to explode because he couldn't help himself. The Splendor was a 60-foot yacht that RJ had purchased in the early 1970s, naming it after the film that had earned Natalie one of her Academy Award nominations. It was a beautiful boat, luxurious and well-appointed, with enough space to comfortably sleep 6 people. Dennis Davern had been the boat's captain and caretaker for years, living in the guest house at the Wagner estate, and essentially becoming part of the family. He knew both Natalie and RJ intimately, understood their dynamics, and had witnessed their fights before. On Friday, November 27, 1981, the Splendor departed Marina del Rey with 4 people aboard: RJ, Natalie, Walken, and Davern. The weather forecast called for rough seas and possible rain over the weekend, but they went anyway. And from the moment they left the dock, something felt wrong. Davern later said the tension was palpable from the start, that RJ was already drinking heavily and giving Walken cold, hostile looks that made everyone uncomfortable. The yacht reached Catalina Island late Friday afternoon, and they docked at the Isthmus, a small harbor on the island's north side. The 4 of them went ashore to have dinner, but the meal was awkward and strained, with RJ barely speaking and Natalie trying too hard to keep the conversation light. They drank heavily, as they often did, and by the time they returned to the boat, everyone was feeling the effects. That night, the fighting started in earnest. Natalie was furious with RJ for being rude to their guest. RJ was convinced Natalie was flirting with Wagner right in front of him, and the argument escalated until Natalie demanded to leave the boat. Davern loaded her into the yacht's dinghy, a 13-foot inflatable boat called the Prince Valiant, and took her ashore to the small town of Avalon on the other side of the island. They checked into 2 rooms at the Pavilion Lodge Hotel around 11 p.m., and Natalie spent the next several hours crying and venting to Davern about her marriage. She told him things were worse than ever, that RJ's jealousy had become unbearable, and she couldn't keep living like this. Davern, who'd developed a close friendship with Natalie over the years, later said she talked seriously about divorce that night. She wanted out, wanted her freedom, wanted to start over without the constant suspicion and control. Natalie tried calling her friend, but couldn't reach anyone who could pick her up from the island that late at night. The weather was getting worse. Boats weren't running until morning, and she was stuck in Avalon with nowhere to go. So she stayed at the hotel, drinking wine with Davern and pouring out her heart about how trapped she felt. Davern later said if Natalie had made it back to the mainland that night, she would have filed for divorce within the week. She was done with RJ, done with the marriage, done pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. But the next morning, Saturday, November 28th, Natalie had a change of heart. Maybe she felt guilty for abandoning the weekend. Maybe she thought she could smooth things over. Or maybe she was just exhausted from fighting and wanted to give peace one more chance. Whatever the reason, she told Davern they were going back to the Splendor, and they returned to the yacht around 10 a.m. Natalie made breakfast for everyone, trying to reset the mood and salvage what was left of the weekend. She suggested they move the boat to a different location, somewhere more private and peaceful, and RJ agreed. They relocated the Splendor to the more remote Emerald Cove on the opposite side of Catalina Island, away from other boats and prying eyes. For a few hours, things actually seemed better. They ate lunch, lounged on the deck, and tried to enjoy the beautiful scenery. But by late afternoon, the tension was creeping back. RJ had been drinking steadily all day, and when he drank, the jealousy came out in passive-aggressive comments and hostile silences. Around 5 p.m., Natalie and Wagner decided to go ashore to Doug's Harbor Reef, a restaurant and bar in the harbor area. They left without RJ, which infuriated him even more. And by the time he and Davern joined them at the restaurant around 6:30 p.m., the powder keg was ready to explode. The waitress who served them that night, a woman who'd worked at Doug's Harbor Reef for years, later gave a detailed account of what she witnessed. The 4 of them ordered 2 bottles of wine, 2 bottles of champagne, and someone was drinking multiple daiquiris on top of all that alcohol. Natalie barely touched her food, seemed agitated and upset, and at one point threw a drinking glass onto the floor where it shattered. Wagner immediately jumped in, claiming he'd made a toast and dropped his glass first, so Natalie was just following his lead. But the waitress saw what really happened. Natalie was angry, fed up, and expressing her frustration the only way she could in public without causing a bigger scene. The restaurant manager became so concerned about how drunk they all were that when they finally stumbled out around 10 p.m., he called the harbor master to make sure they got back to the Splendor safely. They did make it back to the boat, but the night was far from over. Once aboard, Natalie changed into her nightgown and warm socks, trying to wind down and get ready for bed. She joined the 3 men in the salon, the yacht's living area, where Davern had already opened another bottle of wine and lit some candles to create a more relaxed atmosphere. Natalie put a kettle on the stove to make tea, hoping the ritual would calm everyone down. RJ and Walken were still talking, their conversation growing louder and more animated as the alcohol kept flowing. Davern couldn't tell if they were arguing or just having a passionate discussion, but the energy in the room felt volatile and dangerous. And then, without warning, RJ snapped. He grabbed the open wine bottle from the table and smashed it against the wooden surface. The glass pieces scattered everywhere, and the red wine splashed across the salon. RJ stood up, pointing at Walken, and screamed, "What are you trying to do? Fuck my wife?" The question was like a bomb that had just detonated, and nobody moved. Natalie, humiliated and furious, stood up without saying a word and walked to the master stateroom, slamming the door behind her. Walken, shocked and uncomfortable, retreated to his own cabin at the front of the boat. Davern, not wanting to get caught in the middle of whatever was about to happen, went up to the bridge at the top of the yacht. But he could hear everything. RJ followed Natalie into their stateroom, and the yelling started immediately. Accusations, denials, and insults, all the worst things you say to someone when you're drunk and angry and hurt. Davern heard the sound of things being thrown, furniture being knocked over, and what sounded like a physical struggle. He became so concerned that he walked back down from the bridge and knocked on the stateroom door. RJ opened it, and Davern was struck by his appearance. He was sweating profusely, his face was flushed red, and his eyes had a wild, out-of-control look that scared Davern. "Is everything okay?" Davern asked. RJ glared at him and said, "Get the fuck out of here. Go away." So Davern went back up to the bridge, giving them space, but still listening to make sure things didn't escalate further. The fighting continued for several more minutes, and then it moved. Davern heard the stateroom door open, and the argument spill out onto the back deck of the boat. Their voices were still loud, still angry, and the fight seemed to be intensifying rather than dying down. Davern stayed on the bridge, unable to see what was happening because the yacht's rain shield blocked his view, but he could hear every word echoing across the water. And then, suddenly, there was silence. Complete and total silence. No voices, no sounds of struggle, no movement. Just the creaking of the boat, the wind, and the gentle slapping of waves against the hull. Davern waited, thinking maybe they'd gone back inside or decided to cool off separately. But the silence stretched on for 10 full minutes without any sign of either of them. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, Davern went back downstairs to check on them. He walked through the salon, past the broken glass and spilled wine that nobody had cleaned up, and approached the master stateroom. When he looked inside, he found RJ standing there alone, crying. "She's gone," RJ said. "Natalie's gone. She's missing." Davern searched every inch of that boat, checked all the cabins, looked in the bathrooms, searched the deck, even checked the engine room thinking maybe she'd gone down there to escape the fighting. But Natalie was nowhere on the Splendor. When Davern came back to report that he couldn't find her, RJ pointed out the stern and said the dinghy was gone too. The Prince Valiant, which had been securely tied to the back of the yacht with 2 separate lines, had disappeared. Somehow, in the 10 minutes between when Davern heard the fight stop and when he came back downstairs, both Natalie and the dinghy had vanished into the night. RJ's immediate explanation was that Natalie must have gone into town. Maybe she was still angry and needed space, so she took the dinghy to find a bar or restaurant in Avalon where she could cool off. Davern looked at RJ like he was insane. It was after midnight. The seas were rough. Natalie was wearing a nightgown and socks. She couldn't swim, and she was terrified of water. There was absolutely no chance she would take the dinghy anywhere alone, especially not at night in dangerous conditions. Davern suggested turning on the Splendor's powerful searchlight to scan the water, but RJ said no. Maybe they should radio the Coast Guard and report her missing. RJ said no again. Let's just wait and see if she comes back. So they sat there in the salon, drinking scotch straight from the bottle, while Natalie was somewhere out in the dark, cold water. An hour passed, then another. RJ kept insisting she'd just gone into town and would be back soon, refusing to let Davern call for help. Davern later said he was afraid of RJ at that point, afraid of what he might do if Davern disobeyed him, so he went along with the delay, even though every instinct told him something terrible had happened. It wasn't until 1:30 a.m., more than 90 minutes after Natalie disappeared, that RJ finally agreed to call for help. But even then, he didn't tell the Coast Guard to search the water. He asked them to check the bars and restaurants in Avalon to see if Natalie was there. The Coast Guard dispatcher, confused by the request, asked if they should also search the waters around the yacht. RJ hesitated, then said yes, but his reluctance was noted in the official report. The search began immediately, with Coast Guard boats and helicopters sweeping the area around Catalina Island. Meanwhile, local boat owners who heard the distress call joined the search, including Doug Bombard, a friend of RJ's who lived on the island full-time. Bombard knew Natalie and RJ well, had socialized with them many times, and was devastated when he heard she was missing. He took his boat out just after 3 a.m. and searched through the dark, stormy night, along with dozens of other vessels. The hours dragged on with no sign of Natalie or the missing dinghy, and as dawn broke over Catalina Island on Sunday, November 29, 1981, everyone began to fear the worst. At 7:44 a.m., Doug Bombard spotted something red floating in the water about 200 yards from shore near Blue Cavern Point. He steered his boat closer and realized with horror that it was Natalie's down jacket. And inside the jacket, floating face down in the cold Pacific Ocean, was Natalie Wood's body. Bombard later described the moment as one of the worst of his life. Seeing his friend's lifeless body bobbing in the water, knowing she'd been out there alone for hours while everyone searched, helpless to save her. He radioed the Coast Guard immediately, and within minutes, authorities arrived to retrieve the body. Natalie's body was wearing the same flannel nightgown and blue wool socks she'd had on when Davern last saw her alive. The red down jacket had absorbed water like a sponge, weighing her down instead of acting as a flotation device the way it might have if it had been properly zipped. Her hair was floating around her head like seaweed, and her skin had the pale, waxy appearance of someone who'd been in cold water for many hours. Meanwhile, Bombard headed to the Splendor to break the news to RJ. He pulled his boat alongside the yacht and climbed aboard, where he found RJ, Wagner, and Davern waiting anxiously for updates. RJ immediately asked, "Where is she? Did you find her?" Bombard looked at his friend and had to deliver the worst news imaginable. "She's dead, RJ. She's gone." RJ's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the deck, overcome with grief. Wagner stood there in shock, unable to process what he was hearing. And Davern, who'd known something terrible had happened the moment Natalie disappeared, felt his worst fears confirmed. Within hours, police and investigators swarmed Catalina Island, treating the Splendor as a potential crime scene. RJ and Wagner were taken off the island in a police helicopter that same morning, leaving Davern alone on the yacht to deal with authorities. And in one of the most bizarre details of the entire case, it was Davern, not RJ, who was asked to identify Natalie's body at the morgue. RJ told police he couldn't bear to see her like that, couldn't handle the trauma of looking at his dead wife's body, so Davern agreed to do it. He was driven to the medical examiner's office and led into a cold room where Natalie's body lay on a metal table covered with a white sheet. When they pulled back the sheet, DeVerne saw bruises, cuts, and abrasions he hadn't noticed when he last saw her alive on the boat. The coroner who performed the autopsy, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, was one of the most famous medical examiners in the country, having conducted high-profile autopsies on Marilyn Monroe, Robert Kennedy, and other celebrities. Noguchi's examination of Natalie's body revealed extensive injuries that raised immediate questions about how she died. There were 24 bruises scattered across her body, on her arms, legs, face, and torso, a 4-inch bruise on her right forearm, multiple small bruises on her left thigh, fresh bruises and scratches on the backs of her legs, and a facial abrasion on her left cheek. Noguchi noted all of these injuries in his report, but concluded that they could have occurred as Natalie struggled in the water or tried to climb back into the dinghy. Her blood alcohol level was 0.14, nearly twice the legal limit for driving. The toxicology report also showed she'd consumed painkillers earlier in the day, though not enough to be considered an overdose. Noguchi determined that Natalie had died from drowning and hypothermia, likely clinging to the dinghy for as long as she could before exhaustion and the cold water killed her. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, and within 2 weeks, the case was closed. Detective Dwayne Rashour, the lead investigator, interviewed all 3 men, R.J., Walken, and Davern, and their stories matched almost perfectly. They all said Natalie must have heard the dinghy banging against the yacht and went out to secure it. She probably slipped on the wet swim step, hit her head, and fell into the water. The dinghy floated away, and by the time anyone realized she was missing, it was too late. Rashour found no evidence of foul play, no witnesses who contradicted the story, and no reason to suspect anyone of wrongdoing. It was a tragic accident, pure and simple, the result of alcohol, rough seas, and terrible timing. Case closed. Except Dennis Davern couldn't live with the lie. He'd gone along with RJ's story because he was scared, because he didn't want to lose his job, and because he didn't fully understand what had happened that night. But as months turned into years, Davern became haunted by what he knew. There was no banging dinghy. Natalie wouldn't have gone out to secure it, and RJ had waited far too long to call for help. If you think Natalie Wood deserved better than a husband who waited over 90 minutes to call for help while she drowned, let me know below. What would you have done differently if someone you loved went missing from a boat at midnight? Davern started drinking heavily, moving from place to place, unable to hold down steady work or maintain relationships. The guilt ate at him like cancer, and by the early 1990s, he couldn't keep quiet anymore. He started calling Lana Wood, Natalie's younger sister, late at night when he was drunk and desperate to tell someone the truth. Lana, who'd never fully believed the official story, listened to Davern's rambling confessions and realized her worst fears were probably true. Natalie's death wasn't a simple accident, and RJ knew more than he was saying. But Lana didn't go public with what Davern told her, not yet, because she didn't have proof and didn't want to be seen as a bitter sister making baseless accusations. Davern eventually sold his story to tabloid magazines, giving interviews where he slowly revealed more details about the fight on the boat, RJ's jealousy, and the delay in calling for help. Critics accused him of exploiting Natalie's death for money, and his credibility suffered because of the tabloid association, but he kept talking anyway, driven by a need to unburden himself. In the year 2008, 27 years after Natalie's death, RJ published a memoir called Pieces of My Heart. In the book, he finally admitted to smashing the wine bottle that night, something he'd originally told police happened because of rough seas. He claimed he broke the bottle during an argument with Walken about Natalie's career, not about jealousy or suspicions of an affair, and said Natalie wasn't even in the room when it happened. But that admission, even though it came decades too late, opened the door for people to question what else RJ had lied about. If he lied about the wine bottle for 27 years, what else was he hiding? Why did his story keep changing? And why did he wait so long to tell the truth about something that seemed relatively minor compared to the bigger questions? In November 2011, exactly 30 years after Natalie's death, Dennis Davern and more than 700 other people signed a petition asking the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to reopen the case. The petition outlined inconsistencies in the original investigation, questioned the timeline of events, and demanded a fresh look at evidence that had been ignored or misinterpreted 3 decades earlier. The Sheriff's Department agreed to review the case, and within months, they announced they'd found enough new information to warrant a full reinvestigation. Lieutenant John Carina and Detective Ralph Hernandez were assigned to lead the investigation, and they approached it with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques that hadn't been available in 1981. One of the first things they did was re-examine Natalie's autopsy report. Specifically, the bruises that Dr. Noguchi had noted, but attributed to her struggle in the water. Corina and Hernandez brought in a new medical examiner, Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavagiswaran, to review the evidence and give a second opinion on those injuries. Satyavagiswaran looked at the autopsy photos and came to a stunning conclusion. The bruises on Natalie's body were too numerous, too fresh, and too oddly placed to have occurred in the water. The location of the bruises, particularly on her arms and wrists, suggested someone had grabbed her forcefully. The multiplicity of the bruises indicated sustained contact, not a single slip and fall. And the lack of significant head trauma or facial bruising meant she probably hadn't hit her head before entering the water the way RJ's story claimed. In November 2012, based on this new medical analysis, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office made an unprecedented decision. They officially changed Natalie Wood's cause of death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. That single word change, from accident to undetermined, transformed the case from a closed matter into an open homicide investigation. The announcement sparked a wide buzz through Hollywood and reignited public interest in a case that had been cold for 3 decades. News outlets ran stories about the reopened investigation. Old interviews with Natalie were reshown on television, and suddenly everyone was talking about what really happened on the Splendor that night. The press coverage brought forward new witnesses who'd been silent for years, afraid to come forward or unaware that their information mattered. One of those witnesses was a couple who'd been sleeping on a nearby boat that Saturday night. John Payne and his girlfriend Marilyn Wayne were anchored close enough to the Splendor to hear voices but hadn't reported what they heard in 1981, because they thought it was just drunk people partying. But after seeing the news coverage about the reopened case, they contacted investigators and told them what they remembered. Payne said he was awakened around midnight by a woman's voice calling for help. The voice was desperate, panicked, and seemed to be coming from the water near the Splendor. He heard the woman yell, "Help me! Someone, please help me!" multiple times over the course of several minutes. But Payne also heard a man's voice respond in what he described as a mocking, sarcastic tone. "Okay, honey, we'll get you," like he was making fun of her distress rather than actually helping. Payne assumed it was a drunk couple having an argument, maybe someone pretending to be in trouble as a joke, so he didn't investigate further. But after learning what happened to Natalie, he was haunted by the possibility that he'd heard her final moments and done nothing to help. Another witness came forward with even more damning information. A 12-year-old boy who'd been living near the Wagner home in Los Angeles told investigators he remembered a night years before Natalie's death, when she came banging on his family's door late at night. He was just a kid at the time, awakened by the commotion, and he watched as his parents let Natalie inside. She was terrified, crying, and saying something about RJ trying to hurt her. The boy's parents gave her shelter for the night, and she returned home the next morning. But the incident stuck with him all these years later. This allegation, if true, suggested a history of domestic violence that had never been publicly known. It meant Natalie's death might not have been an isolated incident, but the tragic culmination of years of physical altercations that had been hidden from public view. Investigators tried to verify the story with other family members and neighbors, but most of the people who might have known were either dead or unwilling to talk. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe justice shouldn't take decades while families suffer. Only people who think powerful celebrities should get away with suspicious deaths won't. Detective Hernandez and Lieutenant Karina also discovered something crucial about the dinghy when they examined the Prince Valiant, which had been recovered shortly after Natalie's body was found. They noticed the ignition was in the off position, the gear shift was in neutral, and the oars were tied down and locked in place. This meant Natalie never even attempted to start the dinghy's motor or row it anywhere. She'd simply been in or near the dinghy when it drifted away from the Splendor. The most heartbreaking piece of evidence was the fingernail scratches on the side of the Prince Valiant. Deep, desperate scratch marks showed that Natalie had tried to climb into the dinghy at some point, clinging to its rubber sides as it floated away from the yacht. She must have been in the water, trying to pull herself up into the boat, her fingers scraping against the slippery rubber as hypothermia and exhaustion slowly drained her strength. Investigators theorized that someone could have untied the dinghy while Davern was searching the boat, pushing it away from the Splendor to make it look like Natalie had taken it to shore. But the physical evidence told a different story. Natalie hadn't taken the dinghy anywhere. She'd ended up in the water somehow, and the dinghy had simply drifted away, becoming her only hope for survival as she struggled in the dark, freezing ocean. The swim step at the back of the Splendor, the one RJ claimed Natalie had slipped on, showed no signs of disturbance. The algae and seaweed that naturally grew on the step were completely intact, undisturbed, suggesting nobody had stepped on it that night. If Natalie had slipped on the swim step like RJ's story claimed, there would have been evidence. Disturbed algae. Possibly some fibers from her nightgown or socks, something. But there was nothing, which meant she probably didn't go near the swim step at all. So how did Natalie end up in the water? That's the question that has haunted investigators for over 40 years. The evidence suggests she didn't slip while securing the dinghy, didn't accidentally fall overboard, and didn't voluntarily get into the Prince Valiant to go anywhere. Something else happened on the back deck of the Splendor during those 10 minutes of silence after the fight, something that ended with Natalie in the water and RJ refusing to call for help. In February 2018, Detective Hernandez and Lieutenant Karina held a press conference that stunned the entertainment world. They officially named Robert Wagner a person of interest in Natalie Wood's death, the first time any law enforcement official had publicly connected him to potential wrongdoing. He was the last person to be with Natalie before she disappeared, Karina said, and we need to talk to him about what happened during that time. The investigators tried repeatedly to interview RJ, traveled to his home in Aspen, Colorado, sent letters through his attorney, and made it clear they simply wanted to hear his version of events. But RJ refused every request, with his lawyer stating that he'd already told police everything he knew back in 1981 and had nothing more to add. The refusal to cooperate, while legally within RJ's rights, looked terrible from a public relations standpoint and fueled speculation that he had something to hide. Karina addressed RJ's silence directly in interviews. "If you have nothing to hide, why wouldn't you talk to us? We're not trying to railroad anyone. We're trying to find out what happened to Natalie Wood. If you were there and you know what happened, help us understand." But the silence just raises more questions. The case hit another roadblock when investigators tried to get Christopher Walken to provide more details about what he witnessed that night. Walken, who'd given a brief statement to police in 1981, had spent the intervening decades avoiding questions about Natalie's death. In rare interviews where reporters brought it up, he'd shut down the conversation immediately, saying he'd stopped talking about it 30 years ago and referring people to internet sources if they wanted information. When investigators approached Walken as part of the reopened case, he did agree to speak with them, unlike RJ. But the content of that conversation has never been made public, and investigators won't reveal what Walken told them. They did confirm that Walken is not considered a person of interest or suspect, which suggests his account either supported the known timeline or simply didn't contradict it in meaningful ways. The frustrating reality for investigators is that they've built a circumstantial case that points toward foul play, but they don't have the concrete evidence needed to bring charges. California law requires proof that someone intentionally caused another person's death to prosecute for murder. Simply failing to help someone, even your own spouse, doesn't meet that legal threshold because there's no duty to act under state law. As shocking as it sounds, if RJ watched Natalie drown without calling for help, that alone wouldn't be enough to charge him with a crime. The statute of limitations has expired on every other potential charge: manslaughter, negligent homicide, assault, obstruction of justice, everything except murder. And proving murder requires showing that RJ intentionally put Natalie in the water or intentionally prevented her from getting out, neither of which can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt based on the available evidence. So the case remains officially open, but effectively frozen, stuck in legal limbo where everyone involved knows something terrible happened, but nobody can prove exactly what. The investigators who've spent years working this case have done everything within their power, interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, built a timeline, named a person of interest, but they can't force RJ to talk, can't compel a confession, and can't prosecute based on suspicion alone. Lana Wood has been the most vocal advocate for justice, giving interviews and making public statements about her belief that RJ was responsible for Natalie's death. "I can't imagine that he purposely would have done anything to hurt Natalie," Lana said in one interview, "but I know things happen when there is too much drinking and fighting. Maybe he didn't mean for her to die, but his actions or inactions led to her death, and he should be held accountable." That statement captures the heartbreaking complexity of this case. Maybe RJ didn't wake up that morning planning to kill his wife. Maybe the whole thing was a terrible accident born from jealousy, alcohol, and rage. Maybe he pushed her during an argument, and she fell into the water. Maybe he just didn't stop her from falling. Maybe he panicked when he realized what happened and made catastrophically bad decisions that sealed her fate. Or maybe, as RJ has maintained for over 40 years, Natalie really did try to secure a dinghy that was banging against the yacht, slipped on a wet step, hit her head, and drowned before anyone knew she was missing. Maybe the bruises came from her struggle in the water. Maybe the delay in calling for help was just shock and confusion. Maybe RJ's story has changed over the years because trauma affects memory. Maybe he refused to talk to investigators because his lawyers advised him not to, not because he has something to hide. The problem is that RJ's version of events requires believing a series of unlikely coincidences and unexplained details. It requires believing that Natalie, who was terrified of water and couldn't swim, would voluntarily go onto the back deck alone at midnight to fix a dinghy that Davern says wasn't making noise. It requires ignoring the untouched algae on the swim step, the unstarted dinghy motor, and the fresh bruises that looked like assault. It requires accepting that RJ had innocent reasons for waiting 90 minutes to call for help, refusing to turn on searchlights, and lying about the wine bottle for 27 years. Like and subscribe if you believe everyone deserves justice, not just the rich and powerful. Also drop a comment if you feel RJ might be guilty of a crime, based on all the available evidence so far. Robert Wagner turned 94 years old in February 2024, still living quietly in Aspen with his third wife, actress Jill St. John. He's never been arrested, never charged with any crime related to Natalie's death, and has maintained his innocence throughout the decades of speculation and investigation. His daughters, Natasha and Courtney, have stood by him, defending their father against accusations and supporting his decision not to cooperate with investigators. From their perspective, RJ is a grieving widower who lost the love of his life in a tragic accident and has been unfairly persecuted by conspiracy theorists and tabloid journalists for over 40 years. They argue that he's told his story multiple times, cooperated with the original investigation, and shouldn't be forced to relive the worst night of his life just because some people refuse to believe the truth. But from Lana Wood's perspective, and from the perspective of the investigators who've worked this case, RJ is the only person alive who knows exactly what happened in those crucial 10 minutes of silence on the back deck of the Splendor. He was there. He was the last person to see Natalie alive, and his refusal to provide a detailed, consistent account of those final moments is the biggest obstacle to finding the truth. The Splendor itself has changed hands several times since 1981, eventually ending up in Honolulu, Hawaii, with a new owner who had no connection to Natalie or RJ. When investigators traveled to Hawaii in 2013 to examine the boat as part of their reopened investigation, they brought Dennis Davern with them to walk through his memories of that night. Davern stood on the deck where he'd last seen Natalie alive, pointed to the spot where he'd heard the fight move to the back of the boat, and recreated the timeline as he remembered it. The investigators measured distances, took photographs, and tried to understand the physical layout of the yacht and how events might have unfolded. But 40 years had passed. The boat had been modified and renovated by subsequent owners, and whatever forensic evidence might have existed in 1981 was long gone. The restaurant where Natalie had her last meal, Doug's Harbor Reef, still operates in Catalina Islands Harbor. Tourists visit without knowing the history, eating at the same tables where Natalie sat hours before her death, drinking at the same bar where she laughed with Christopher Walken, while RJ watched with growing anger. The waitress who served them that night eventually gave her story to investigators, confirming that the tension at that table was palpable and that all four people were extremely intoxicated. The Prince Valiant dinghy, with its fingernail scratches and unstarted motor, sits in an evidence warehouse somewhere in Los Angeles County, tagged and cataloged, waiting for a trial that will probably never come. It's a piece of physical evidence that tells a heartbreaking story of a scared woman clinging to rubber sides in freezing water, trying desperately to climb aboard, her strength fading as hypothermia set in. Natalie's films continue to play on television and streaming platforms, introducing new generations to her remarkable talent. People watch West Side Story without knowing that Maria dies in the ocean in real life and us. They watch Rebel without a cause, without understanding that Natalie's character's fear of parental disappointment mirrored her own fear of her mother's controlling ambition. They watch Splendor in the Grass without recognizing that Deanie's mental breakdown reflected Natalie's own struggles with identity and agency. Her legacy should be those performances, those characters, the way she could convey complex emotions with a single glance. But instead, Natalie Wood is remembered primarily for the mystery of her death, for the unanswered questions and suspicious circumstances that overshadow everything she accomplished in life. That's the real tragedy, when a person's death becomes more famous than their life, when speculation replaces celebration, when conspiracy theories overshadow artistry. And maybe that's what happens when powerful people refuse accountability, when investigations drag on without resolution, when families are denied closure. The victim becomes frozen in time, forever defined by their final moments rather than their lifetime of achievements. Natalie Wood deserved better than that. Deserved better than dying terrified in the water she'd feared since childhood. Deserved better than a husband who waited 90 minutes to call for help. The investigators who worked this case for over 6 years did everything possible within legal constraints. They interviewed more than 150 witnesses, followed up on hundreds of leads, re-examined forensic evidence with modern techniques, and built a timeline that exposed inconsistencies in the original investigation. They named Robert Wagner a person of interest, held press conferences to publicize their findings, and made it clear they believed Natalie's death was not a simple accident. But at the end of the day, they couldn't force RJ to talk, couldn't compel a confession, and couldn't prosecute without concrete proof of intentional harm. So the case remains open, technically active, but realistically stalled, waiting for new evidence that will probably never materialize, or a deathbed confession that may never come. Like, subscribe, and comment. Justice for Natalie, if you're not siding with people who wait over 90 minutes to call for help when their spouse goes missing. Let me know if you think Robert Wagner's decades of silence speak louder than any confession ever could. Lieutenant Karina and Detective Hernandez both retired from active duty without seeing the case resolved. But they made a promise before leaving. We're not ever going to close it until we get to the truth. That promise means future investigators will inherit this case, will continue following leads, and will keep the file active as long as there's even a slim chance of finding answers. The truth about Natalie Wood's death doesn't lie at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, washed away by 40 years of tides. It doesn't exist in autopsy reports or witness statements or forensic evidence. The truth lives in the memory of one man who's chosen silence over explanation, protection over honesty, legal safety over moral responsibility. Robert Wagner knows whether Natalie fell, jumped, was pushed, or climbed into that water some other way. He knows why he waited so long to call for help, why he refused to turn on the searchlights, why his story has changed repeatedly over 4 decades. He knows the truth, and he's taking it with him to the grave. That's his legal right, protected by the Fifth Amendment and supported by his attorneys. Nobody can force him to incriminate himself. Nobody can compel testimony that might be used against him, and nobody can prosecute him based on speculation alone. The American legal system, designed to protect the innocent from wrongful prosecution, also protects the potentially guilty from accountability when evidence falls short of the standard required for conviction. So we're left with this haunting reality. Natalie Wood died in the water she'd feared her entire life, surrounded by people who could have saved her, but didn't. And the man who was supposed to protect her has refused for 40-plus years to answer the one question everyone wants answered. What really happened on that boat? The fortune teller who predicted Natalie's death by drowning got the method right, but couldn't see the full picture. She didn't predict the jealous husband, the long weekend of alcohol-fueled arguments, the fight that ended in unexplained silence, or the deliberate delay before anyone called for help. She didn't foresee the decades of questions, reopened investigations, changed autopsy findings, or the person of interest who chose silence over truth. All she saw was dark water, and she was right about that. The dark water was always waiting for Natalie, patient and inevitable, ready to fulfill a prophecy made before she could even walk. But the real question isn't whether the fortune teller was right. It's whether someone helped that prophecy come true. Natalie Wood's grave is in Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, not far from the graves of Marilyn Monroe, Dean Martin, and other Hollywood legends. Her headstone is simple, elegant, and heartbreaking in its restraint. It reads, "Beloved daughter, sister, wife, mother, and friend. More than love." A birth date and death date, but no mention of how she died. Just love, remembered and cherished. Lana Wood visits that grave regularly, still seeking the closure that 4 decades of investigation haven't provided. She was 35 years old when Natalie died, young enough to believe justice would come quickly, that truth would prevail, that the system would work the way it was supposed to. Now in her late 70s, Lana has spent half her life fighting for answers that may never arrive. "Before my life is over," Lana said in a 2018 interview, "I would like to put Natalie's to rest by knowing the truth." It's a heartbreaking statement because time is running out. RJ is 94, Lana is in her late 70s, and the few remaining witnesses from that night are dying off one by one. Soon, everyone who was there will be gone, taking their memories and secrets with them, and the truth will be lost forever. The case of Natalie Wood's death will remain one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, not because the truth is unknowable, but because the people who know it have chosen silence. It will remain unsolved not because investigators failed to find evidence, but because the legal system requires a higher standard of proof than circumstantial evidence and suspicious behavior can provide. And it will remain a tragedy not just because a talented actress died too young, but because justice was delayed so long that it became justice denied. 40 years is too long to wait for answers. 40 years is too long to protect someone who might be responsible. 40 years is too long for a family to suffer without closure. Natalie Wood deserved better than to die terrified and alone in that dark water. She deserved better than a husband who waited so long before calling for help. She deserved better than investigators who closed the case without asking hard questions. She deserved better than 4 decades of legal maneuvering, media speculation, and a carefully crafted silence. Most of all, she deserved the truth, and that's the one thing no one has been willing to give her. If you believe powerful people shouldn't be able to avoid accountability forever, if you think Natalie Wood case would have been handled better, if you stand against the kind of silence that protects the rich and famous while families suffer, then make your voice heard. Because the only way these cases ever get solved is when enough people refuse to let them be forgotten. Justice for Natalie Wood isn't just about solving a 40-year-old mystery. It's about standing up and saying that wealth and fame shouldn't shield people from consequences, that silence isn't the same as innocence, and that some questions deserve answers no matter how much time has passed. The truth may be locked in the memory of RJ, who has chosen to take it to his grave, and when he's gone, when the last person who knows what really happened is finally silent forever, Natalie Wood's death will join the ranks of Hollywood's permanently unsolved mysteries. Not because we couldn't find the truth, but because we were never allowed to hear it.
I want to thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what's coming next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for instant updates on our latest videos. See you in the next one.